Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Edinburgh International Book Festival. Those of you who know me already will probably see that I am very thrilled indeed to be hosting this event. This is a story very close to my own heart, and I'm here to introduce you to an extraordinary and inspiring woman who has written this amazing children's book to coincide with the centenary of the birth of her father, Nelson Mandela. I was twice the BBC's Southern Africa correspondent, and my first stint there coincided with President Mandela's term in office, so I had the privilege of meeting him 2 or 3 times. So it's a great privilege for me to introduce you to Zindzi Mandela. I would like to thank as well the sponsors of this event, the Royal Bank of Scotland. Without the sponsors, our festival would not be what it is. We're very grateful for your long-standing friendship. Zindzi, a children's book. Yes. Why?
I think it was very important to do that because, first of all, it's important to document, our stories for the current and future generations. As we spoke earlier, that, there are many young people who know that Nelson Mandela was once president without knowing what his story is and the journey that he traveled to get to that point. So it's very, very important. And especially for the African child to know that irrespective of where you come from and irrespective of the challenges before you, that it is possible to rise to your highest potential.
Your own children knew their grandfather very well. What about your grandchildren? They know him only as a kind of presence in the past.
Yes, I mean, they just knew him as somebody who loved children. That's their fondest memory. But, and when he passed away, they were very young, particularly Zazi and Ziwelen, with whom we did the book. So for them, every time they see a picture, they want you to put it into context. Grandma, what was Granddad doing here? Where were we? And so on. And that is actually how the book project began, where we thought, this is an interesting conversation. Their voices represent the voices of other children, millions of other children their age, who would also like to ask questions, would also like to understand what happened to us historically in the way and the format that children would best appreciate.
Zindzi will be signing copies of this book after the event in the signing tent next door. If you have children or grandchildren or great-grandchildren in your life, get a copy, give it to them, get Zindzi Mandela to sign it, and 30 years from now, they will give it to their own children. It's a once in a blue moon opportunity to do that. I want to ask you, though, about your own childhood, which was very tough indeed. You were just 18 months old when your father went to jail. And therefore your mother was forced to become a single parent. What was life like for her in those years?
Well, I mean, the more I think about it, especially now, now that she's left us, is to admire the amazing strength of a single mother, how she was able to play the role of both parents, whilst being a leader at the same time to her own people, whilst hoisting my father's, the flag of the organization very high, making sure that his people didn't forget him, and also she embraced so many other children that we call our struggle cousins. So we were never really alone. It wasn't just us, and that they had very much in common, where they were able to be parents beyond the biological framework and embrace other children who needed parenting and who needed a place of safety and security.
But you witnessed as a very young child some very cruel and deliberate treatment meted out to your mother. How did you cope with you and your older sister? How did you cope with that?
Well, I think we drew strength from her, and how she always held her head up high, and we never saw her broken or bruised. And how she'd also say to us, I never want to see you cry, because somebody somewhere will ask, I wonder whatever happened to Matiba's children. There are millions of other children in similar circumstances nobody will ask anything about. So I will not tolerate that. You will not make the enemy happy. You will always put on a very brave front.
I mean, there are episodes in your mother's autobiography where she describes security police coming to the house at 2 in the morning and hauling her out with you clawing at her skirts. Do you remember those episodes?
Vividly. I haven't forgotten any of that. I even remember the first time she took food to my father when he was still locked up in Pretoria before he went to Robben Island. And she couldn't understand how I remember that because I was so young. And I say, it's just, if something happens to you that's quite traumatic, it's not easy to forget. She was just an incredibly amazing and brave woman, and I'm so proud, to be her daughter. And I know that my father also appreciated the role that she played in keeping his name alive, in keeping our comrades in the struggle highly motivated.
And she spent, I think, more than a year in prison while you were a child.
More than once. I mean, she was constantly in and out of detention. We were used to the raids at 3 a.m. We were used to all of that. And when we eventually ended up at boarding school in Swaziland, I was at 5, my sister was 6, because we couldn't last in any schools in South Africa without the interference of the security police, who would intimidate principals and would be eventually suspended as children from school.
And as a consequence, compared to your contemporaries in South Africa, who were deliberately and systematically undereducated by the apartheid state, you got a very good education.
We were
indeed.
very lucky. So in that sense, there was, where you say every dark cloud has a silver lining. That was our silver lining. But it meant being removed from our home and so at a very early age, at a very vulnerable age, where even as we were at that school, we'd be often told like what was going on in her life. Like if she was attacked at night, the nuns would make it a point that they told us. That school was very appropriately named Our Lady of Sorrows, I can tell you that. But I must just say, despite all the curious and bizarre experiences we had there as well, we also developed strength of character,
And there were times when you would go home for the school holidays, and she, in anticipation of your arrival...
The security police would have locked her up the very same morning that we arrived there. Like, we're looking forward to seeing our mother. She wasn't one of those parents who could come and see us at school. We never had, I've never experienced personally a parent coming to my school, to any school meetings, to watch us performing plays and so on. We've never experienced that. So we would go for months without seeing, my mother. And then on the day that we come back, from Swaziland and we arrive at home, we find like doors broken down, etc. She'll have been detained that same morning. And our family wouldn't even know that this has happened immediately because, people go about their business, go to work and so on, and don't necessarily check on her to see if she's okay. So we found, like, in many ways, we got adoptive parents, adoptive grandparents, adoptive cousins, as I say. The struggle, as much as the system tried to break you down and fragment your family, somehow the struggle lent you a new definition of family that was in the form of comrades or sympathizers.
And did you, as a child, hanker for a normal family environment?
Of course I did. I mean, children can be very cruel. I mean, sometimes my dad was referred to as a prisoner, but there's a derogatory term where you say bandit that's based on bandit. Like, children would tease us and say, after all this, you don't have a father, this is what he is. And you'd find like among some kids there was more respect for families that had fathers, at home. For us, it was very difficult, but we realized that there was something unique about our circumstances because whenever his name was mentioned, there would definitely be a reaction. Mm. It would either be a positive one, sympathetic, or hostility, or fear, but it always elicited some kind of like response that was noticeable even to us as children.
And were you always clear about what it was for? Did your mother educate you to understand why your family was being put through this?
Oh, definitely. I mean, like she'd explain to us, for example, like when she would be arrested, she'd explain, this is why they're doing this to me, We are champions for freedom, justice, for us to have a voice. Do you know that we still can't vote? We had to understand these concepts from a very early age, So as much as we were children, there were very adult issues we had to deal with, and we had no choice because the system itself had put us in such a situation whereby as we were children, we had to live very adult lives at the same time.
I once followed your father on a visit to the Soweto Cricket Oval. The England international team played there for the first time since the lifting of the sporting boycott on a one-day friendly against the Soweto Select. And Nelson Mandela turned up unannounced. And there was chaos, absolute chaos. And the two teams lined up and shook his hand. And I was just standing behind his shoulder. And you could see these young men from Soweto gazing at Nelson Mandela. And you could see the extraordinary reverence and gratitude that they had towards him. And then his security people were having a nightmare. He decided he'd go on a tour of the crowd, waving, and the security people were panicking all over the place. And then as he was leaving, he walked past a section that had been reserved for wheelchair users. And one of the wheelchair users called him over, and he said in English, Madiba, I want to thank you for all you've done for our people. It's an amazing achievement. And your father said, yes, it is an amazing achievement. And do you know whose achievement it is? It's yours.
That was typically him.
And it's theirs. This was done by a generation of South Africans, not by one man. That was, and he said it spontaneously and from the heart. So that was part of his special talent, wasn't it?
That was part of his modesty and how he never viewed himself as somebody great in isolation. He always, referred to himself as a collective. We, my comrades and I. We, my comrades and I. And he felt very uncomfortable if he was singled out. Like, for example, right now, the centenary we're celebrating his and that of Mama Albertina Sisulu.
Yeah.
He would have, if he was with us, said, you know what, let's put her first, and then perhaps next year we can, focus on mine, because he felt very uncomfortable with that type of attention.
Yeah.
So much so that, your story reminds me of one of the trips we took to, during his presidency, that we took to the United States, and as his partner. And when he was doing his usual walkabouts, greeting people on the streets and so on, and defying security and, as usual, creating chaos and havoc, there's a lady who held on to him, and she was very emotional. She wept, and she kind of lost her step. She was a bit dizzy, and he held her. And then, of course, when we got back into the car, he was quiet all the way as we drove back to the residence. He was very quiet in the car, and he was also quiet, over lunch. And I asked him, I said, Matiba, what's wrong? And then he said, darling, that woman, did you see how emotional she was? And I said, yeah, I saw, I was there. And he says, I wonder why. And for me, then it really struck home that, the modesty is genuine. There were no cameras, there was nobody else there. He was genuinely concerned. Like for him, he thought it was a health matter. Yeah. And so it didn't occur to him at all that that's the impact he had, on her. And that's, one aspect of him that was very touching. He was very genuine in terms of his humility, genuine in terms of his modesty. Even when he tried to joke about how great it was always a joke. It always make fun, because he just couldn't understand what it was that people saw in him. For him, it was all about his party, the ruling party, his comrades, or him being a typical South African. It was always about a collective, not Nelson Mandela alone.
Mm. I saw him once with Bill Clinton in Johannesburg after Bill Clinton had stopped being president, and Bill Clinton gave a speech first, and then ex-president Nelson Mandela came to the microphone and he said, this young man is showing real promise. And that same day at the Soweto cricket, I just remembered this for the first time, that same day at the Soweto cricket ground, he went into the press tent, and there were all these cricket correspondents from the British newspapers who looked up, and suddenly there's Nelson Mandela standing in front of them. And he said, have you got any questions? And of course, they had no idea what to ask him. And so one of them said, what activities were you interested in as a young man, sir? And he said, oh, I can't tell you that. Too many police here, I might end up behind bars. And he was a very funny man, wasn't he? Very developed sense of humor.
Yeah, I mean, even when he was preparing us for the eventuality of his passing, he would often, make up these stories, like trying to prepare us psychologically for the fact that, that any time now, he wasn't as young anymore, and he wasn't as healthy anymore, and in many ways he could also be very prophetic. And he used to tell us the story, about how when he eventually dies and crosses over to the other side, and he'd say, darling, you have to make sure that you've reached the right destination, that this is heaven. And then he says, and I'll come with my 2 paper bags. He never referred to a bag. It would always be paper bags. I have no idea why. Maybe it's recycling. I have no idea. But he'd say, I'll come with my 2 paper bags and put them down there at the pearly gates. And just to make sure I'm in the right place, I'll say, excuse me, can you call Albert Lutuli for me? And if a message comes back from one of the archangels who say, sorry, he's still busy with the big man, then you go, can you please call Oliver for me? And if he's still not available, then you try one more time, you say, please call Walter Sisulu for me. And if all these men are busy, you must look around carefully. And then he says, but if you see over there somewhere Hitler scrubbing the floor, you will know you've come to heaven because there's Humble the dictator.
Yeah, that was a typical of him. There was. I want to ask you though about that first moment when you were allowed to see him for the first time. You were 15 before you came face to face with him. What was that like going to Robben Island?
You know, my mother had done her utmost best to prepare me psychologically for what it would be like, that I'd be seeing him in prison, that we'd be separated by a partition, that, you know, with a bit of glass, like for me to see his face, and a little box in front that acted as a microphone and be speaking on phones, and that there'd be prison warders on either side of us. She'd prepared me, but despite all of that, it was still like quite a shock to walk into the room and see that. And I just felt like, I felt further violated by having to see my father for the first time like that. It's my first experience, and I can barely utter a sentence without these grown men trying to intimidate me, trying to censor a simple comment about my health to my dad. So for me, it was extremely difficult. But then my dad had this power of persuasion, extremely charming, and one of the first people who taught me to appreciate the power of the imagination. And he said to me, look here, darling, just imagine that you're sitting on my knee, we're sitting in front of the fireplace, and I'm reading a story to you, and I'm bouncing up and down on my knee, and we're laughing and we're joking, and you're asking me questions about the story I'm reading to you. And as it did that, it was almost like it almost had a hypnotic effect. The warders and the harshness of that particular experience, and you know, just the brutality of it just faded into the background, and it was just my dad and I in that visit eventually.
How often were you allowed to see him in prison?
Twice a month, and we would just target a weekend because we're traveling from afar. It was expensive to be able to go to Cape Town, so we'd go and see him, make it a point we leave perhaps on a Friday so we could see him on the Saturday and see him on the Sunday and travel back home. And there was a time when the visits were only 30 minutes long, you know, but even that 30 minutes, we'd managed to achieve so much just in terms of like relating to him and, you know, cherishing every moment with him. And again, you know, the brutality of apartheid taught you so many lessons to appreciate, you know, to put so much value on some things that we take for granted. A simple hello or goodbye, looking into a person's eyes is so important. Remembering what your last conversation was about, you know.
Gillian Slovo, who has been at this festival before, her father was Joe Slovo, who was a member of the ANC with Nelson Mandela and became a minister in President Mandela's government. He was on the run for much of his adult life and in exile, and Gillian's mother, Ruth First, was murdered by the apartheid state in Mozambique with a bomb sent through the post. And Gillian talked very movingly about the experience of growing up in this kind of family. And she said she went through a phase of resenting her parents, feeling angry that they had put the struggle before family life. Did you ever feel that?
Oh yes, I did. I felt that, especially with my dad. My mom was there for us, obviously, so it wasn't as deep because I felt like at least, you know, she was with us at home, despite the fact that she was often behind bars herself. But the beauty about our relationship with my dad is that he always welcomed. You know, he'd always managed to extract it out of you for you to talk and for him to know how you truly felt. And I'm so glad that he did that, you know, where we would talk and I'd just say, you know, like, you know, I really get upset with you because I feel like you haven't been here for us, and now here you're out again and I don't see you. But it reached a stage whereby I had to appreciate the importance of him rising above, you know, just being a family man, you know, to being a leader, because the future of our people, the future of our country took on a greater importance than just, you know, this family unit, a normal family unit that I'd never had. And fortunately, you know, being an activist myself, maybe that's actually what also drove me to the struggle to say, you know, I have to find some kind of reward in what I do. I have to be in service to my people and so on. And it's interesting because that type of thing is spilling over even into, the next generation and the next generation of Mandelas, this culture of volunteerism and service.
It is, though, a lot to ask two little girls to understand, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It is. And at some stage it eventually became, a joke because my father also taught us that. In fact, my mother as well was like that, where they relied on their sense of humor, almost like as a kind of gentle side of strength, to laugh at themselves and, to make fun of things that had happened. And I would always say to him, that it's, I also see much more of you when you're in prison than now that you're president because you're all over the world. I need to get a tracking device and put it in your belt for me to know where you are at any given time. But when you were behind bars, at least I knew I was guaranteed 2 visits.
I want to come on to his term as president shortly, but there's another moment I want to ask you about because I remember it very, very vividly. I was completely immobilized watching you on television, and I'm a little bit older than you, but we're not that far apart in age, if it's not too rude to say so.
We remember Woodstock, right?
Yeah. And it was 1985 in Soweto, and your father had been offered, so it's already 5 more years to go, but at that time we thought he would be in prison all his life. And the South African government had offered your father a conditional release. You will let you out of prison, but you go back to your village in the Eastern Cape, you go back to Kunu, and you retire, and you don't appear in public. That's right. And he refused this. Did you have mixed feelings about his decision to refuse?
Yes, I did. At first, I felt quite honored that he wanted me to read it, because he could have asked anybody, any of the leaders at the time, but he insisted that I must read the speech.
Yeah, let me just explain that. Zindzi, your mother wasn't allowed to address a crowd.
But she was there. She was hiding in the crowd.
So but she was
She
banned.
snuck out, yeah.
So she was there illegally. So Zindzi, at the age of very early 20s, read this statement from her father to this extraordinary crowd. You can see it on YouTube. Just Google Zindzi Mandela 1985, and it's an extraordinary moment. And I remember it very clearly, and comparing the privileges and liberties, and the theme of this festival is freedom. I remember thinking about the liberties that my own country gave to me and comparing them with the way your country deprived you of them, because I identified very strongly because we were roughly the same age. What was that moment like for you?
It was, I always describe it as a bittersweet moment because I'd always wanted my father to come back home. And when I heard that he was being offered a release, I had to really introspect and think about this. And as much as I'd always been my dream to have my father back home, I mean, which young girl wouldn't? I also had to respect the decision that he took and say to myself, would I rather my father comes back more in his capacity as a father, but less of a principled man because he's agreed to a conditional release? Or would I rather have a father still kept away from me, knowing that when he comes back eventually, that he will come back as a hero in my eyes, and a man that I'd be eternally proud of because I knew what he stood for? And would it have been worth it for him to have been away already for more than 20 years, to compromise right at the end? What example would it set to people who had been looking, up to him as an icon, as an inspiration of hope, somebody whose values and, principles people wanted to live by? Would it have been worth it?
And
no,
that was
wouldn't.
his thinking, that it would have destroyed the point of his whole life of struggle, including 20 years in jail.
Yes, I mean, there was even a time where the system offered him, they made an offer to say, why doesn't your family move in with you at Victor Verster prison? And Victor Verster, if you remember, was where they actually separated him from his comrades and they put him in a house, in a home-like environment, but behind prison walls. It was within a prison.
This was towards the end of his 27 years.
Yes, towards the end, and he was quite cheerfully telling us over lunch, telling my mom, hey, Mom, they've made this offer. Wouldn't it be great if we were all here with the children? And then she said, Madiba would still be in prison.
Yeah.
We'd be glorified prisoners, and he eventually understood that. But, honestly, as much as it was difficult for me because I was breaking inside, as I had to say to people, my father's not coming back home. Not now, not ever, right at this moment. We didn't even think it was those 5 years. But at the same time, to hold my head up high and say with pride, my father's not coming back home, but inside, longing for him to come back.
And those were really difficult years, weren't they? Were they the hardest years, the last years of
Some
in
of
the
the
80s?
hardest because the brutality of the system increased.
And the violence in the townships?
And the violence, it was like a difficult. We lost thousands and thousands, of young people. But, eventually we got to see him come back home.
So tell me about that moment. It all seemed to us to happen very suddenly, but you must have known that there were talks in the background that were leading up to his eventual release.
Yes, I know, because if you remember, it was my mother who confronted Kobe Coetsee, the then Minister of Justice, at the airport, and then she walked up to me and said, "When are you releasing him? When are you releasing my husband?" And so on and so forth. And then, then he promised to speak to her. I mean, and the rest is history. That then they started visiting him in prison to have these talks. Then I learned that's when my father discovered that, rather, I don't think it's a great tasting dessert wine, because they would sip this wine with Kobe Coetsee as they were discussing, the future of the country. So, I had a sense of that. But at the time, when my father was released, or rather the day they announced his release, I had just had a child with somebody who was part of the military wing of the ANC. And he had just been killed, one of those mysterious deaths behind bars in detention. And when we were burying him, somebody came to whisper in my ear, "I need to take your mother away because FW is about to make a statement." And then I said, "Oh," and he said, "Yes, and we think they'll be announcing, the possibility of your father's release." And that for me was a very painful time, another bittersweet time, because I thought...
Because you were at the funeral of your
child's father. I was at the funeral,
father.
and he was, a member of the ANC, military, the underground, and here he's being buried. And if there's anybody who deserved to see my father come back, he was one of them. And so for me, I had to celebrate my father coming home at the same time as in mourning. And isn't it interesting, even now, we're celebrating his centenary and my mother's just passed on. So there are lots of these bittersweet moments that define various chapters in our lives that we've learned to live with and find some kind of balance.
And it didn't take very long after his release for you to fully understand that he was the father of the nation, and you had to share your father with the nation. Was that hard?
It was. Well, at first, we had typically father and daughter frustrating moments, because when my dad came out, I was living alone with my 3 children, and he moved in with my mom. And then one day he just rocked up at my place and he said, "You're moving in with us." And I said, "Will this be wise? I'm an independent woman, a mother of 3. And he insisted, no, darling, you've got to move in with us." So I thought, you know what, let me just give it a try. I've always wanted to know what it's like to have both parents at home. Well, very soon it turned into quite a nightmare, because every time I wanted to go out, especially as a single woman, he'd say to me, "Darling, who is your chaperone?" And I'd say, "My what?" No, who is your chaperone? Because, especially for ladies, it does not look proper. I said, "To whom?" I said, "This is what we do." And then he started giving me curfew. "Where are you going to?" And then he writes it down. "Is there any telephone number where you're going to?" And I insist you must be back here by 12:30. And I'm thinking, who does this? For all the days you were locked up, you take it out on me. You're forgiving your captors, but you're imprisoning me. So we had those interesting moments, and how with one of my sons, Bambata, who was a baby when my dad came out, and my dad hadn't held a baby in a long time. We even fought over how long I was going to nurse this child. He was saying, "I think this child should be put on the bottle and come and sleep with me and mom." And I'd say, "I don't understand how you feature in this type of decision." But of course, eventually I gave in, as everybody does. And he would go and do his formula at night and change the diapers and so on and so forth. But we had those moments whereby I thought, "Oh man, I wanted this man back home, but really..." So we had those, interesting moments together.
And during the day, he was saving the nation.
Exactly. And it reached a point whereby when I didn't see him, I'd actually be delighted, because I had a sense of freedom. Like if he was traveling abroad, ticker tape, I'd be like, "Now's my time to get around,
In those 4 years between his release and the elections that made him president, there were difficult years, and it seemed to take forever. And the people on your side of the negotiating fence were getting more and more frustrated, more and more angry, and a sense that they were being cheated of the promise of the Mandela release was building up among the public. And then there was the moment Chris Hani was assassinated. South Africa was very, very close to some serious bloodshed and collapse, wasn't it? Your father went on television
Yes.
and told the story about the white lady, the Afrikaans lady. Can you just relate that?
Yes, I mean, my father had been, he was away on holiday when Chris Hani was assassinated. And immediately when this happened, he took a decision to come back, and to speak to the country, because he realized that it could have taken another turn for the worst, that the country would be up in flames. And too much work had gone into the reconciliatory framework for that to happen. And also that, he wanted to, just in case this was some kind of setup to make sure that the course of history is derailed, he made it a point to come and speak, And I'm not sure which story you're referring to, whether it isn't about Betsy Verwoerd in Orania.
No, it's there was a woman who overheard the killers of Chris Hani.
Yes, and she called the police and she reported. So, in other words, so as much as you could have had this violent response to Chris Hani's death, how ironic that it was a white woman, anyhow, who's the one who was vigilant and who reported to the police that this has just happened. And my father's message was always about seeing the good and the humanity in people, even the people who were the oppressors and the people who are the ones who looked after him in jail. Look at the relationship he had with Christo Brandt that our family still has to this day. Christo Brandt was a warden who looked after my dad. But my father saw again, the sense of humanity and respect in Christo Brandt. And Christo Brandt did special favors for us. Like there was a time when we went to see my father and we went allowed contact visits. And Christo, without telling my mom, because my mom sometimes couldn't keep a secret, he took my daughter and went to the back and smuggled her in for my dad just to hold her and so on. And then brought her back. We only learned years afterwards when my dad was released that this is what he did. So he remains, to this day, a family friend. And Christo has got the most beautiful stories about his experience with my dad. And yet he's also such a humble man. We had to beg him to write a book to say, Christo, your story has to be told, because it's a typical South African story to show how we were all liberated, from the harshness, and the imprisonment of apartheid, because in many ways it limited all of us in terms of our interactions, in terms of, cross-cultural experiences and so on. So all of us needed to be liberated from it.
And when he became president, there was a tremendous weight on his shoulders, because when I was living there as the correspondent, all my editors in London would say, well, of course, Mandela's 70-something, and without Mandela, it'll all fall apart. The whole country's future depends on the health of this one man. And I remember, this is another quite funny story, it's just come back to me. He went to hospital for a few days for some checks while I was there, and he used to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, didn't he? Because that was a prison habit. And so he left hospital at about 5:30 in the morning, and all the journalists were there waiting, and he came out, and they were throwing questions at him. And one of the reporters from 702, I think, radio station said, Mr. President, can you assure us that the checks and tests you've had are comprehensive? And he said, well, I must admit, I haven't yet been examined by a gynecologist.
I didn't know about that.
Yeah. And he said, and another thing, he said, look, I'm the only head of state in the world who has to go jogging in the morning to shore up the value of the currency.
Yeah.
So, but when I used to get asked what comes after Mandela, I would say the rule of law is what comes after the Mandela. And his major achievement, it seems to me, is creating a country where the rule of law prevails. And since I know you're a professional diplomat now, an ambassador, you work for the South African government, it's difficult for you to talk about politics. But South Africa, since your father left office, has twice removed a president through constitutional means. That says a lot for the achievement, doesn't it?
But it actually says a lot that our constitution actually works, that our judiciary works, that we've got systems in place. I think we're a proud example of the continent, despite the fact that we're one of the youngest democracies.
One of the things that used to be said, especially in the former white suburbs, was that prison somehow moderated him. Prison mellowed him, and he came out much more ready. But in fact, if you look at the values he articulated when he came out of prison, they were identical to the values that got him into prison in the first place. He was remarkably consistent.
He was consistent, and I mean, the fact that he was the first commander-in-chief of the military wing of the ANC spoke very much to the way in which, passive resistance was responded to, with an act of brutality by the system, the Sharpeville killings and so on. Therefore, the response of the oppressed people had to escalate their response to the brutality of the apartheid system. And then when he went to prison, there's a tendency for people to define my father according to him being in prison for 27 years and coming out to forgive his captors. And there's kind of like nothing before that. But what is important to note is that it's the lessons that he learned in the valley, the indigenous knowledge systems that he learned, sitting in the village of Kunu, listening to the elders, that formed his character and gave him the capacity to survive those challenging years and to be able to rise above it and extract something positive out of that, because it talks very typically to who we are culturally and traditionally as a people and the lessons that we are taught by our elders. And I think it's very important to also focus on that part of him, because Madiba is normally viewed as a global icon and very seldom as that African boy who came from this village of Mvezo and Kunu and who impacted on the global scale. And I think when that is done, he tends to be depicted as a tree trunk with no roots, and then often like with no branches or leaves, which is the community that he comes from, which is the continent that he comes from. And I think the thrust has to be very strongly Pan-African, especially, with what's happening now in the world and this, the global displacement of communities. It's important for those, for people, for Madiba's people, the continent diaspora, to know that your circumstances don't have to limit your growth. Your circumstances don't have to defeat the possibility for you to survive those particular experiences. That his example should be inspirational to everybody else who experienced the same type of life experiences.
It was hard at the time for many people around the world to understand how a family could have come through what your family experienced and not have burning hatred in their hearts.
Well, I think it's because of the example, that our parents set. It could have gone the other way. It could have, and the fact that they allowed us to be angry when we were angry, recognized that we're insecure when we're insecure, but made sure that our voices were heard, which means that we had a way of actually finding each other, meeting each other halfway to understand the bigger picture. That it wasn't necessarily about our own personal emotions, that there always was a bigger picture.
Your parents' marriage didn't survive the ordeal. When it was clear that they were separating, that must have broken you. Of
course. But the reality was this, that marriage is a very difficult institution in itself. And you are told when you get married that if you survive the first year, oh, great. And then if you survive the first 7 years, then wow, you've passed that 7-year itch and so on. But my parents didn't have the first year.
Yeah.
He was on the run to the extent that they didn't even cut their wedding cake.
Yeah.
There wasn't time for that.
She kept the wedding cake,
yes, she kept it. There was no time for that. That's how much he was like on the run. It was just enough to say, I do. Okay, see you later, gone, because he was on the run, the system was looking for him. So that was it. So they had no chance to build a solid foundation. Their love for each other, although it was strong, wasn't enough. Because even when a couple love one another, you need to have those building blocks to have a solid foundation that will withstand any external challenges. So they didn't have that. So with everything else that happened to affect the relationship, it had very shaky ground. And it was painful, Alan, it was painful to see them separate. And, I mentioned earlier that my father never viewed himself in isolation, that he always viewed himself as part of a collective. His greatness wasn't his alone. It was always about him and the movement and him and his comrades. But if you remember, even when he left my mother, in the statement that he made, he never referred to himself as I. He said, my colleagues and I So it was his colleagues as well as himself who were divorcing her.
And did you feel hurt on behalf of your mother?
Oh, yes, I did.
Did you take her side?
Yes, I did. I mean, there was a time when I actually didn't speak to my father for about 2 years. And then my big sister, Magaziwe, and my late brother, Mahatu, actually came to see me at some stage. She said, no, you've got to come and see him. He's pining, He really, he feels very hurt and so on. And I appreciated the fact that they encouraged me to go and speak to him, because when I spoke to him and I told him I was hurt, how I felt like that, he could have been more supportive of her. She was just going through serious problems at the time. And it was very interesting because he was just very quiet and he nodded. And I left and I went back and I spent some time with my mom. And in no time I realized that he had heard me, because there were certain changes.
I was in Kunu the day of his funeral, and I was watching your mother's face, and she was stricken with grief. So by the end of his life, they had reconciled, hadn't they?
Of course they had. And I mean, my mother always referred to him as the love of her life, and so did he. And so did Mama Grasa. Because when I first met Mama Grasa, my father was very naughty, very mischievous, even with his dating history. Because he'd always make it a point that he would call me very late at night after 10 or 11 and say, hold on, you must say hi to your auntie. And I realized this auntie is around quite a lot. This auntie is around at very interesting hours too. And even when we travel, when I'd go with him, let's say I'm his companion for a particular visit, he'd do the same thing. She would call conveniently when we together at table, that it would say, hold on and say hello to your daughter here. So I thought, I wasn't born last night, or rather, honestly, I know what's going on here. But when I first met her as well, when I met her and I was my father's partner, she actually said, I've known a great love with Samora, and your father's known a great love with Mama Winnie. There's no ways that I'm going to try to take her place in his heart, in the same way that there's a special place in my heart for Samora.
Samora Machel was the Mozambican president who was killed in a plane crash,
yes.
And that was her first husband. So.
That was her first husband. Yeah. And, and even the way in which, because for many years after my parents separated, they didn't communicate. They communicated through my sister. It was quite exhausting, actually. It was terribly exhausting, because every time my father wanted to have breakfast at 7, I knew exactly. He had a message from my mom. And every time my mom said, I don't want to see you, it's because she was aware that I had a message for her from my dad. So it was, we went through that for a bit. But the day that they actually reconciled was very interesting to us. There was a traditional ritual for my son that I'm with here at Zonda. He had gone to the mountain, as we said, gone for initiation, and we do things very traditionally. And where he had done it, when a man comes back, when a boy comes back as a man, he comes back to his ancestral home, and that was Kunu. And somehow it coincided with my dad's birthday. So my mother was questioning how patriarchal this whole thing is. And I'd be sitting with her in one room, and I go to another room, and I say to my dad, my mother's complaining that side. She says, this is nonsense. She can't be forbidden from going to the kraal simply because she's a woman. But it was that type of banter, But that was the day that there was this beautiful reconciliation between all three of my parents. And I really appreciated it. And it was so tender. And it was one of those unique moments that the world doesn't really know about. But my Mama Grasa doesn't like to wear anything on her head. She finds it very restrictive. And my mother knows how her in-laws are. And she'd say to her, when we go down and meet Zonda, you have to put something on your head. And Mama Grasa said, no, it's warm. And so no. And Mommy said, no, I know my in-laws trust me. It'll be an issue someday. Put something on your head. And Mama Grasa put something on her head. And we went down to welcome Zonda. And we were turned back because he wasn't ready. And Mama Grasa's headgear was a kind of skewed, tilted to the side. And my mom reached over to tie it up for her. And then Mama Grasa put her head on my mother's shoulder, and my mother held her. And the rest was history. Then they walked back to the house together. And my mother didn't turn to look back for me once, and I knew that we'd be okay.
That's a beautiful story. Thank you. We started late, so with your permission, I'm going to overrun. It's the last event in the venue, so we'll be okay. I want to get the house lights up now, please, and see whether you have questions from the floor. We've got some microphones going around. Who has a question? They're all a bit awed. Yep, there's one up there. Yep.
Most probably too hot.
Put your hand up high so I can see you. There's a question. Yep. Anybody else here? Yeah, and there's one here, yeah. Yes.
Can you see me, Zindzi?
Yes, I can see you.
Those Bulbulia from South Africa.
Yes.
That was so absolutely beautiful. Thank you so much. I think the last bit in terms of that reconciliation, because as Allan says, we saw Mama Winnie's face when Tata died. And we felt that pain because I could see it in her body. So I'm quite emotional to know that there was that moment where all three of them were together. So thank you for sharing that with me. And I'm really excited about the book. Just for people to know, I'm from South Africa, and Zindzi is my sister.
Please tell them who you are, like your heritage.
So I'm Indian South African, and we've just made a film for Nelson Mandela's centenary entitled Nelson Mandela, True Pan Africanist. And the film was made because, as Zindzi says, she really wanted the story of her father as the Pan-African to be told. And so in October, we met together at the embassy, and she said, I really want people to know the other side of Tata. They know him as a statesman, they know him as the president, but they need to know him as a Pan-African. And we made the film. It was shown in South Africa on SABC on the 16th of July, just 2 days before his birthday. We're very excited for that. And so we've had a very close relationship, and so I wanted to surprise you.
Thanks.
That's why I didn't let you know that I was going to be here.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed. We've got a question here.
Here in Scotland, we're actually set up a Nelson Mandela Scottish Memorial Foundation, and I'd like to know what you think we in the world should be doing to preserve your father's legacy.
I think, the fact that one of his last press conferences, he said, it's in your hands, meaning that the greatest gift we could give him is to actually live his legacy. And one campaign that we can support and recognize is the Nelson Mandela Day. When he turned 90, he said to people, please do not buy me gifts, do not spend any money on me, I don't want any financial currency, I want acts of generosity and volunteerism in honor of my birthday. And he said that I've given 67 years of my life to the betterment of humanity. All I ask is that on my birthday, you spend 67 minutes of your time on that day in an act of charity, in an act of compassion. And it could range from cooking chicken soup for a sick neighbor, to going to help build a school, to making, perhaps like donating wheelchairs to a project. But those are the different ways in which we could keep his legacy alive. And it doesn't necessarily have to be in South Africa only. It must be where you are. Because remember what the great Mahatma said, that you are the change that you want to see in this world. So within the framework of your particular location and experience, you can also make a difference there. And I think that would be the best way, because his sense of compassion and generosity was pure. And there was a lot of integrity in that.
Education was very important to your father, wasn't it? He talks in his autobiography about going to Fort Hare College, which is one of the few places where black people could get a higher education. He genuinely revered education and believed it was a liberating force.
Yes, and he went out of his way to even create opportunities, for the youth. And interestingly enough, it was even across the color line at a time when you'd find people from the white community experience were more privileged, but he was just this person who would respond first as a father and a grandfather, as opposed to looking at your particular circumstances. If you wanted to study, trust me, you would have his full attention, especially as a young person.
That day in Soweto in 1985 when you read out his message to the people, and part of it was he had decided not to make a statement to the government but to address the people directly. Do you think he was proud of you?
I hope so.
Did he say so?
Yes, he did. Yes, he did.
And your mother too?
Yes, and my mother too. My mother was banned at the time. She was under house arrest, and she wasn't even supposed to be in Johannesburg, but she ended up there because I have a cousin sister who looks very much like her in terms of height and so on. So this poor woman was a decoy, and she was being watched and observed by the security police. And my mother was dressed as a domestic worker somewhere hiding over there in the crowd. So I mean, like, you know, the mischief of both my parents is something like quite entertaining, and, well, I mean, lessons to learn, you know.
But the other thing, to be serious for a second, that when the Truth and Reconciliation sat under the chairmanship of the amazing Bishop Desmond Tutu, he asked your mother to say sorry. After all she had been through, some part of the nation expected her to apologize too. How did you feel about that?
I felt very hurt. I felt very hurt and very betrayed because I knew the role that my mother had played, where many people had turned a blind eye, especially when it came to, you know, the more riskier political involvement where she risked her life. And in many ways, we were also, you know, we also risked our lives for, you know, this fight for justice and so on. So, but what I'm happy about is that I always promised my mother that I would see to it that she's vindicated in the court of public opinion. And there's a documentary that we co-produced with Pascal Lamsha called Winnie, where in that documentary, the security police themselves acknowledge how they set her up, how they worked, were in collusion with some journalists, were in collusion with some of our own comrades in bringing her down. It was very important to them to break down the marriage. It was important for them to also destroy her, as somebody who was very symbolic of the consciousness of our people. So I'm very glad I was able to do that. And then even about Stompie's death, because she's always been accused of Stompie's death. I don't know if you're aware that after her passing, Stompie's mother was one of the people who came to pay her respects.
This is the story of the little 14-year-old little boy who died in the township violence. And,
yes,
and your mother was accused of being
Yes, and she
complicit.
came, and then and during the TRC,
the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Yes, whenever she went to the bathroom, she had a small child at the time, it was about 3 or 4. She'd always put the child on my mother's lap and then go out to the bathroom. And psychologically, what does that tell you? She feels that the child is safe and secure with mommy. But since my mother's passing, she's actually given an interview where she has said, you know, Winnie did not kill my child. And she was actually speaking up for my mother. So needless to say, we're going to have a part 2 now in terms of the document, because lots more stories are coming forward. And security police who we never thought we would ever cooperate with one day are the ones coming forward with stories, more stories, detailing how, you know, all the different strategies that they employed to, you know, to destroy her.
Yes.
Thank you for the session. I just wanted to say that first. Definitely. Sorry. Thank you for the session. I really enjoyed it. First of all, obviously the sense of humor of your parents has passed on to you. We loved this. My question to you is, you've obviously seen many changes through your life. The world and the attitude has changed throughout. How do you feel today here being in the UK, talking about a book that you've written about your father? And I'm curious to know about this, how you cope with this complex relationship, because I'm Indian as well. It's a very interesting relationship I share with the UK and the English language too. So I'm curious to know how you feel today.
So I didn't hear clearly.
It's quite difficult to hear at this distance. It's about writing the book in English?
No, just how do you feel being here today? Because you've been through so much through your life. Your changing relationship with certain sections of community. How do you feel here being in the UK today and talking about this book?
Okay. No, I'm very proud to be here talking about this book today. And also acknowledging that one of the greatest anti-apartheid movements was based here. So it's always important to go back, you know, to those particular chapters to show our appreciation and to acknowledge that, you know, that people beyond our borders contributed towards our freedom. So I feel very proud to be here. And about interacting with different community experiences, the irony here is this, that as much as apartheid tried to keep us apart, they helped us forge relationships beyond our particular community experiences. So to the extent that in some cases I'd have very close relationships with people from the Indian community experience, from the white community experience, all because we had the struggle in common. And therefore, we had labels for ourselves, like to say we are struggle cousins, or this is my struggle aunt, this is my struggle uncle. So it's very interesting that we were able to turn what was supposed to break us down into a positive. We were able to actually build where they were actually trying to destroy. We were able to formalize, those centers of support and intimacy. And we drew a lot of strength from that.
I'm going to take two more questions at the same time. One from a gentleman at the back there. Yes?
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for some very interesting insights. It's been fascinating. What do you think your father would make of South Africa today, and what do you think the future holds for your country going forward?
Thank you very much. And a question from a lady at the front here.
Firstly, we're privileged, my daughter and I, to be here this evening to listen to you talking about your father as the president and the man. So thank you for that. My question really is about hindsight. You've spoke so well about him being in prison and your fight to have the relationship with him. And I wondered, would you go through the whole thing again? Would you be happy for him to go to prison for all of that time, for him to achieve the freedom that he did?
Let's take them in that order, though, because that's a very good question to end on. First of all, what would your father make of South Africa today?
I think my father would never give up on South Africa. I think you've seen some leaders recently who are the founding fathers of political movements who, at the stroke of a hat, because they've lost power, would then say, today I do not vote for this particular organization or my ruling party. My father has never given up on his people, and he never would give up on his people. What he would encourage, though, is further dialogue amongst conflicting communities. That's his legacy. That's what he's always represented. So I'm sure you may have heard of the various racial outbursts we have had in South Africa, but thanks for his legacy that we've got solution-specific mechanisms in place to deal with those issues. For example, we've got an equalities court, we've got a human rights commission, and so on. We have criminalized any form of hate speech or racism, so there are penalties for that. But I'm saying that I know that people would often say when they view what's happening politically, oh, Nelson Mandela would turn in his grave. If he did turn in his grave, it would be for him to wake up, sit up, and say, okay, people, what is it that we can do better? But not to give up on his country or his people, not at all.
And when you think of all that your family suffered and endured for so many years, not knowing whether it was going to turn out well in the end or not, would you do it all again?
I would do it all again. I can't imagine. That's all I've known. Everything else is just a fantasy. And what I've learned from this is to define myself not according to what I've suffered, the anguish and so on, but according to how I've survived that. And I think it's an important lesson, especially as in my capacity as a mother, as a grandmother. It's very important for me to be able to demonstrate that type of resilience and ability to see, to have a more holistic approach to life for the sake of my children, especially during difficult times.
My thanks to the Royal Bank of Scotland. My thanks to Zindzi Mandela.
Thank you.